Most people believe their life is shaped by the decisions they make. They believe destiny is created in moments of action, the job they choose, the city they move to, the relationships they enter. But long before any action ever takes place, something quieter is already shaping the direction of a life. Thought. Every life is first built in the invisible workshop of the mind. Before a person becomes anything in the world, they first become it in thought. This is why two people can live in the same city, work similar jobs, and yet their lives slowly move in completely different directions. Their circumstances may look similar on the surface, but inside their minds, something very different is being practiced. One person rehearses confidence, possibility, and growth. Another rehearses fear, doubt, and limitation. And without realizing it, each person is quietly constructing the identity they will eventually live out. James Allen once wrote that a man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts. At first glance, this idea sounds poetic, but the longer one observes human nature, the more clearly this truth reveals itself. Thoughts are not harmless background noise in the mind. They are seeds, and every seed eventually grows into something visible. When a thought is repeated often enough, it begins to shape belief. When belief is practiced long enough, it forms identity. And identity, once formed, begins guiding nearly every decision a person makes. This process rarely happens in dramatic moments. It happens quietly, day after day, in the background of ordinary life. A person who repeatedly thinks thoughts of inadequacy slowly becomes someone who expects failure. A person who repeatedly thinks thoughts of courage slowly becomes someone who moves toward opportunity. In this way, the life we experience tomorrow is being rehearsed in the thoughts we practice today. Most people search for ways to change their external circumstances without realizing that the deeper cause of their life pattern is being repeated internally, often thousands of times each day. The mind is not simply reacting to life. It is constantly practicing it, and whatever the mind practices long enough, the person eventually becomes. To understand how powerful repeated thinking can be, imagine a path through a field. The first time someone walks through that field, the grass bends only slightly. There is no clear trail yet. But if the same path is walked again and again, something interesting happens. The grass begins to flatten. The ground becomes more visible. Eventually, a clear trail forms, and walking that direction becomes easier than going anywhere else. The human mind works in a very similar way. Every repeated thought presses a small path into the mind. At first, the path is weak and barely noticeable. But when a thought is practiced again and again, it becomes easier for the mind to travel that same direction. Eventually, the thought becomes automatic. This is why a person who repeatedly thinks negative thoughts often feels as though negativity is happening to them. In reality, the mind has simply built a strong mental pathway that it travels by habit. But the same principle works in the opposite direction as well. A person who deliberately practices thoughts of possibility, discipline, and confidence begins building new mental paths. At first, these thoughts feel unnatural. The mind wants to return to the older, familiar patterns. But if the new thoughts are practiced consistently, something powerful begins to happen. The new path strengthens. Over time, what once felt unnatural becomes the mind's new default direction. This is how character is formed, not through a single moment of determination, but through thousands of repeated thoughts shaping the inner landscape of the mind. People often underestimate this process because the changes appear slow, but like the growth of a tree, the results become unmistakable over time. A person's identity eventually becomes the reflection of the thoughts they practice most frequently. This is why two individuals placed in identical circumstances can respond in completely different ways. Their thinking has trained them to see the world differently. One sees obstacles, another sees opportunity. One sees limitation, another sees possibility. And over time, these differences in thinking lead to very different lives. What many people fail to recognize is that repeated thinking does not only shape beliefs, it shapes behavior as well. A person who repeatedly thinks thoughts of self-doubt often begins avoiding opportunities. They may not consciously decide to avoid growth, but their thinking quietly pushes them towards safer and smaller choices. On the other hand, a person who repeatedly practices thoughts of courage slowly becomes someone willing to act despite uncertainty. In this way, thinking does not remain confined to the mind. It gradually expresses itself through action. Every habit of behavior can be traced back to a habit of thought. The person who consistently practices discipline in small areas of life is often someone who has practiced thoughts of responsibility long before the behavior appears. Likewise, the person who struggles with procrastination often carries repeated thoughts of overwhelm or resistance toward effort. These patterns are rarely formed overnight. They develop slowly through repetition. Every time the mind rehearses a certain thought, it strengthens the mental direction that thought represents. Eventually, the thought becomes a belief. The belief becomes an attitude. The attitude becomes a behavior. And the behavior, repeated long enough, becomes character. This is why James Allen emphasized that thought is the true builder of human destiny. Long before the world sees the results of a person's character, those results have already been forming quietly in the mind. When a person learns to observe their thinking patterns, they begin to see how many of their daily behaviors are simply the continuation of thoughts they have practiced for years. The realization can be both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals how much of life is shaped internally. Empowering because it means those patterns can also be changed. The most important question a person can ask themselves is not simply what they are doing each day, but what they are repeatedly thinking. Because whatever the mind practices consistently becomes the direction life slowly follows. This does not mean that every passing thought defines a person. The mind produces thousands of thoughts each day, many of them fleeting and meaningless. What truly shapes a life are the thoughts that are practiced deliberately and repeatedly. The thoughts we return to, the thoughts we believe, the thoughts we quietly rehearse when no one else is watching. These thoughts eventually form the identity a person carries into the world. Someone who repeatedly practices thoughts of resentment gradually becomes someone who sees conflict everywhere. Someone who practices gratitude begins seeing opportunity and meaning even in difficulty. Over time, the difference becomes profound. The world has not necessarily changed, but the person experiencing it has. This is why self-transformation rarely begins with changing the outside world. It begins with the quiet discipline of observing the mind. What thoughts are being repeated? What mental conversations are happening daily? And most importantly, are those thoughts constructing the life you wish to live? Every identity is built in the same way, through repetition. Not repetition of action alone, but repetition of thought. And when a person begins deliberately choosing the thoughts they practice, something remarkable happens. They begin quietly reshaping the person they are becoming. In time, the world begins reflecting that change, because a life is never built all at once. It is built thought by thought, day by day, until the person eventually becomes what they have practiced thinking all along. If we observe the lives of people around us long enough, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. People rarely rise suddenly into a new way of living. Instead, their lives gradually become the outward expression of the thoughts they have practiced for years. A person who constantly rehearses discouragement begins to see discouragement everywhere. A person who rehearses resentment eventually begins interpreting even neutral situations as personal attacks. And a person who rehearses confidence slowly becomes someone who sees possibility where others see only limitation. None of these changes occur overnight. They unfold gradually, often so quietly that the individual experiencing them does not even realize what is happening. Thoughts, when repeated, become attitudes. Attitudes, when repeated, become habits. And habits eventually form the character that others recognize in us. This is why two people who begin life with very similar circumstances can end up in dramatically different places. Their thinking quietly guided their path. The person who constantly entertains thoughts of growth eventually becomes someone who seeks learning. They begin reading more, exploring new opportunities, and placing themselves in environments where improvement becomes possible. The person who entertains thoughts of limitation often does the opposite. They avoid risk. They withdraw from opportunities. They begin convincing themselves that certain achievements belong only to other people. Over time, the difference between these two individuals becomes profound. One life expands, the other contracts. Yet the cause was not some dramatic external event. The cause was the silent practice of thought. One of the most powerful realizations a person can have is understanding that the mind is constantly practicing something. Even when we believe we are simply reacting to life, the mind is quietly reinforcing certain patterns. Consider how often people replay the same mental conversations in their thoughts. They imagine arguments, revisit past mistakes, or rehearse fears about future events that may never even happen. Each time this mental rehearsal occurs, the mind strengthens the emotional pattern connected to it. The individual begins experiencing the same emotional responses again and again, not because life demands it, but because the mind has practiced those reactions repeatedly. But this same principle also offers a tremendous opportunity. If the mind can be trained to rehearse fear, it can also be trained to rehearse courage. If it can be trained to rehearse limitation, it can also be trained to rehearse possibility. This does not require unrealistic optimism or pretending that life has no challenges. It simply requires directing attention toward thoughts that encourage growth rather than those that reinforce defeat. The person who practices constructive thinking gradually develops a different internal environment, and that internal environment eventually influences everything else in life. Decisions change, opportunities become more visible, confidence grows, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the direction of a life begins shifting. There is a quiet moment that eventually arrives for many people. It is the moment when they begin noticing the patterns of their own thinking. At first, this realization can feel uncomfortable. It means recognizing that many of the conditions we experience in life are not random events, but reflections of the mental habits we have practiced for years. A person who constantly expects disappointment often finds themselves noticing every small sign that confirms that expectation. A person who believes progress is possible begins noticing opportunities that others overlook. Both individuals live in the same world, yet their experiences appear completely different. This difference begins inside the mind. The thoughts we return to again and again gradually shape what we notice, what we believe is possible, and how we respond when life presents a challenge. Once a person becomes aware of this process, something powerful begins to change. They realize that the mind is not simply reacting to life, it is participating in the creation of it. This awareness does not mean every thought must be controlled or that the mind must become perfectly disciplined overnight. The human mind will always produce many passing thoughts. What matters is the thoughts that are welcomed and practiced. The thoughts we give attention to repeatedly begin forming the emotional atmosphere of our lives. They influence how we interpret events, how we respond to difficulty, and how much confidence we carry into the future. Over time, a person who deliberately chooses thoughts of patience, courage, and possibility begins developing a very different inner environment than someone who constantly rehearses frustration or doubt. This shift may appear subtle at first, but the longer it continues, the more visible its effects become. Attitudes change, decisions change, the way a person carries themselves in the world begins to change as well, and slowly the life they experience begins reflecting the thoughts they have chosen to practice. Every life eventually becomes a reflection of the thoughts that were practiced most often. This does not mean life is free from difficulty or that every event can be controlled by the mind. Challenges are part of every human experience. Unexpected moments will always appear. Yet even in the presence of difficulty, the direction of a life is still strongly influenced by the thoughts a person repeatedly returns to. Some individuals spend years reinforcing ideas of limitation. They quietly repeat to themselves that progress is unlikely, that circumstances cannot change, or that their efforts will make little difference. Other individuals begin cultivating a different mental habit. They deliberately practice thoughts that encourage growth, responsibility, and resilience. Over time, these internal habits begin guiding the course of a life. A person who practices courage begins acting with courage more often. A person who practices gratitude begins noticing more reasons to feel grateful. A person who practices discipline begins discovering how much progress steady effort can produce. None of these changes occur through a single dramatic moment. They occur through repetition. Thought by thought, day by day. The identity a person eventually carries into the world is not created in a single decision. It is built gradually through the thoughts that are practiced when no one else is watching. Every quiet moment of thinking is shaping something. Every repeated idea is strengthening a direction. And eventually, whether we realize it or not, we become the person those thoughts have been forming. For this reason, the most powerful question we can ask ourselves is simple. What thoughts am I practicing each day? Because the person we become tomorrow is already taking shape in the thoughts we choose today.